The morning sun peeked through the clouds over London as 52-year-old Richard Whitfield stepped off the plane at Heathrow Airport, his wife Diane and their teenage son trailing behind him. A successful car dealership owner from a small town in Ohio, Richard had finally given in to his family's pleas for a European vacation. London was their first stop, and Richard had already decided what he thought about it before the plane's wheels touched the tarmac. "Too crowded," he muttered, pushing past an elderly couple to grab his luggage from the carousel. "And the air smells funny." Diane gave an apologetic smile to the couple. After 25 years of marriage, she had mastered the art of smoothing over her husband's rough edges. Their son Tyler, 17 and permanently attached to his phone, barely looked up as they navigated through the busy terminal. "I read that we should visit Buckingham Palace first," Diane said, unfolding a carefully planned itinerary. "The changing of the guard happens at 11. If we hurry with check-in at the hotel, we could make it." Richard grunted in response. He hadn't wanted to come to England at all. His idea of a vacation was fishing at the lake house or maybe a cruise where drinks were included. But Diane had insisted this trip would broaden their horizons, whatever that meant. The taxi ride to their hotel in Westminster gave Richard plenty to complain about. Driving on the wrong side of the road, the small cars, the accent of their driver who had the audacity to chuckle when Richard asked if they could swing by Stonehenge on the way. "It's in Wiltshire, sir. About 2 hours from London," the driver had explained, catching Diane's eye in the rearview mirror with a knowing look that further irritated Richard. Their hotel room wasn't ready when they arrived, another inconvenience that Richard took personally. They left their luggage with the concierge and headed toward Buckingham Palace on foot, with Richard grumbling about the drizzle that had started to fall. "We paid good money for this trip," he said, refusing the umbrella Diane offered. "You'd think they could arrange better weather." The closer they got to the palace, the larger the crowds became. Tourists from all over the world gathered along, the fence, cameras ready, children on shoulders, everyone eager to witness the famous ceremony. "We're never going to see anything in this mob," Richard complained, using his broad shoulders to push through the crowd, ignoring the annoyed looks thrown his way. But Diane had done her homework. She led them to a spot she'd read about online, slightly to the side where the view wasn't obstructed by the main crowd. They arrived just as the ceremony was about to begin, the precision and pageantry of it all immediately capturing Diane and Tyler's attention. Richard, however, found it all rather boring until he spotted one of the guardsmen taking up his position. "Well, look at that," he said, loud enough for nearby tourists to turn their heads. "Didn't expect to see one of them in the Queen's Guard." The guardsman in question was Sergeant James Okonkwo, though Richard didn't know his name or rank. Richard saw was a black man in the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat, standing ramrod straight with the discipline that came from 10 years of dedicated service to the crown. "Richard, please," Diane whispered, noticing a family with young children nearby. "Not here. I'm just saying," Richard continued, his voice not lowering one bit. "You'd think they'd keep certain traditions traditional." He emphasized the last word with air quotes. A woman standing nearby, a London native who brought her visiting niece to see the ceremony, turned to give Richard a cold stare. "That tradition you're referring to has included soldiers from all Commonwealth nations for generations. Perhaps you should educate yourself before making such comments." Richard's face reddened, not from embarrassment but from anger at being challenged. "I didn't ask for your opinion, lady. This is a free country, isn't it? Or am I not allowed to speak my mind?" "Dad, seriously," Tyler hissed, finally looking up from his phone, his face a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "Just watch the ceremony or let's go." Richard fell silent, but his eyes remained fixed on Sergeant Okonkwo, whose face showed no reaction. Years of training had prepared the guardsmen for all kinds of weather, long hours of standing still and, unfortunately, tourists like Richard. As the ceremony continued, Richard's mood worsened. He took out his phone and began taking photos, zooming in specifically on Sergeant Okonkwo. "Look at him," Richard said to Diane, showing her a photo he'd taken. "Bet he's the first in his family to even visit England, and now he's guarding the palace? The world's gone mad." Diane didn't respond. After years of marriage, she had learned when to fight her battles with Richard, and when surrounded by hundreds of strangers wasn't the time. Besides, she was captivated by the precision of the ceremony, the gleaming buttons on the red tunics, the synchronization that came from countless hours of practice. When the ceremony ended, most tourists began to disperse, heading to gift shops or nearby cafes. But Richard lingered, still watching Sergeant Okonkwo, who now stood at his post, still as a statue. "Let's get closer," Richard said, already moving toward the barrier rope. "I don't think that's allowed," Diane said, but Richard was already pushing forward. They ended up just a few feet from where Sergeant Okonkwo stood guard. Up close, the guardsman was even more impressive, over 6 feet tall with perfect posture, not a wrinkle in his uniform, his boots so polished they reflected the cloudy London sky. "I want to see if these guys really don't move," Richard said, fumbling with his phone camera again. "Hey, buddy," he called out to Sergeant Okonkwo. "Smile for the camera." Sergeant Okonkwo remained motionless, his eyes fixed forward as his training demanded. But Richard wasn't satisfied with being ignored. "Can you believe this?" he said loudly to a couple standing nearby. "They let anyone wear the uniform these days. When I was a kid, the Royal Guards looked like, Royal Guards." The couple quickly moved away, wanting no part in Richard's commentary. A palace security officer in a dark suit had noticed the commotion and began moving in their direction. "Richard, that's enough," Diane said firmly, grabbing his arm. "We're here as guests in their country. Show some respect." "Respect?" Richard scoffed. "I paid thousands of dollars to visit this place. That gives me the right to say what I think." Tyler had wandered several feet away, pretending not to know his parents. A group of teenagers nearby had started filming Richard, sensing the potential for viral content in his behavior. The security officer approached with a polite but firm expression. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back from the barrier and keep your voice down. The guards are on active duty." "Active duty doing what? Standing around looking pretty?" Richard shot back, but he did take a small step back, just enough to keep the officer from escorting him away. "It's not like they're in actual danger. This is all for show anyway." What Richard didn't understand was that the Royal Guard weren't merely ceremonial figures. They were fully trained soldiers, many with combat experience from deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. Sergeant Okonkwo himself had served 2 tours before being selected for the prestigious role at Buckingham Palace. The security officer remained nearby as Richard continued to take photos, making comments under his breath that were just quiet, enough to avoid further intervention but loud enough for Diane to hear and cringe. "We should go see the Tower of London next," she suggested, trying to move them along. "The crown jewels are supposed to be spectacular." "In a minute," Richard said, his attention still fixed on Sergeant Okonkwo. There was something about the guardsman's dignified stillness that irritated Richard deeply, though he couldn't have explained why. Perhaps it was the contrast to his own restless dissatisfaction, or perhaps it was something darker, something that had been nurtured in the small, homogeneous town where Richard had spent his entire life. As raindrops began to fall more steadily, tourists opened umbrellas or sought shelter. The weather provided Diane with another opportunity to suggest moving on. "We're getting soaked, Richard. Let's find somewhere to have lunch." Richard checked his watch, surprised to see they'd spent over an hour at the palace. His stomach rumbled, in agreement with Diane's suggestion. "Fine," he said, taking one last photo of Sergeant Okonkwo. "But we're coming back tomorrow. I want to see if these guys ever crack a smile." As they walked away, Richard scrolled through the photos he'd taken, zooming in on Sergeant Okonkwo's face. "I'm going to post these online when we get back to the hotel. Ask my friends back home what they think about the new look of the Royal Guards." What Richard didn't realize as they left Buckingham Palace was that his fixation on Sergeant Okonkwo was just beginning. He also didn't notice the group of teenagers who had been filming him upload their video to social media with the caption, "Racist American at Buckingham Palace, Day 1. We're going back tomorrow to see if he gets himself arrested." The stage was set for what would become one of the most viewed tourist incidents in recent London history. and neither Richard nor Sergeant Okonkwo knew that their paths would cross again, with consequences neither could anticipate. Richard woke up the next morning in their hotel room with a sense of purpose that had been missing from his vacation so far. While Diane was in the shower and Tyler still asleep, he scrolled through social media to check on the photos he'd posted of Sergeant Okonkwo. To his surprise, instead of the supportive comments he expected from his friends back home, several had called him out. "Not cool, Rich," wrote his golf buddy. "That guy's serving his country." Another comment read, "My nephew's in the British Army. Those guards are elite soldiers, not tourist attractions." Richard deleted the post with an angry grunt. No one understood his point. It wasn't about the man being a soldier, it was about... Well, Richard wasn't entirely sure how to finish that thought without saying the quiet part out loud. Breakfast at the hotel was a tense affair. Diane had planned a full day of sightseeing, the Tower of London, Westminster Abbey, and a river. Cruise on the Thames. Richard, however, had other ideas. "I want to go back to the palace," he announced, cutting off Diane's enthusiastic description of the crown jewels. "There's another guard ceremony at 11. "Again?" Tyler groaned, finally looking up from his phone. "It was boring yesterday." "No one's making you come," Richard snapped. "You and your mother can go look at old buildings if you want. I'll meet you back here for dinner." Diane's face fell. This trip was supposed to bring them closer as a family, not split them up on their second day. "Richard, please. We came all this way to see London together." But Richard had made up his mind. There was something unfinished about yesterday's visit to the palace, though he couldn't quite articulate what it was. All he knew was that the guard, that Okonkwo fellow, had gotten under his skin somehow, standing there so proudly in a uniform that Richard felt should belong to someone else. "I'm going back," he said firmly. "You two do whatever you want." And so, at 10:30 that morning, Richard found himself once again approaching Buckingham Palace, this time alone. The crowd was smaller today, the weather clearer. Richard maneuvered his way to the same spot as yesterday, scanning the guards for Sergeant Okonkwo. At first he didn't see him, and a strange disappointment settled in his chest. But then, as the ceremony began, he spotted the sergeant marching with the same precision as the day before, his face a mask of professional focus. "There you are," Richard muttered under his breath. A tour guide stood nearby with a small group, explaining the history and significance of the changing of the guard. Richard edged closer to listen. "The guards you see are active duty soldiers, primarily from the Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards, Irish Guards, and Welsh Guards," the guide explained. "Many have served in combat zones before being selected for Royal Guard duty, which is considered one of the highest honors in the British military." A tourist raised her hand. "How are they chosen?" "It's a highly competitive selection," the guide answered. "They must have an exemplary service record, perfect discipline, and meet the physical requirements, including the height requirement of at least 5'10" for the bearskin hat to look proportional." Another tourist pointed toward Sergeant Okonkwo. "Has the guard always been diverse?" The guide nodded. "The British military reflects the diversity of both Britain and the Commonwealth nations. Soldiers from all backgrounds have proudly served the Crown for generations. In fact, during World War II, over 2 million soldiers from Africa, the Caribbean, and India fought for Britain." Richard scoffed loudly enough for nearby tourists to turn and look at him. The tour guide gave him a brief disapproving glance before continuing her explanation. When the ceremony ended and the guards took their positions, Richard noticed that Sergeant Okonkwo was stationed at a post closer to the palace gates today. Without the buffer of his family, Richard felt bolder. He walked right up to the barrier rope just a few feet from where the sergeant stood motionless. "Back again?" a voice said beside him. Richard turned to see one of the security officers from yesterday, a man in his 40s with the patient expression of someone who had seen every type of tourist behavior imaginable. "Free country, isn't it?" Richard replied defensively. "Indeed, it is, sir," the officer said. "Just remember to respect the barriers and the guards. They're working, not performing." Richard nodded stiffly, but as soon as the officer moved along, he took out his phone and began taking more photos of Sergeant Okonkwo. This time, he decided to record video as well. "Hey, buddy," he called out, his voice carrying in the relative quiet of the mid-morning. "Do you guys get bathroom breaks, or do you just have to hold it all day?" Sergeant Okonkwo remained perfectly still, eyes forward as trained. A few tourists nearby chuckled uncomfortably, while others shot disapproving looks at Richard. Encouraged by even this minimal reaction, Richard continued, "I'm guessing they stationed you out here because you're good for diversity photos, right? Gotta keep up with the times." A middle-aged woman standing nearby with her young daughter frowned at Richard. "That's incredibly rude," she said in an Australian accent. "Why would you say something like that?" "I'm just making conversation," Richard replied, though the sergeant hadn't responded at all. "Not my fault if people can't take a joke." "It's not a joke if no one's laughing," the woman said, taking her daughter's hand and moving away. Richard felt a flash of annoyance. Why was everyone so sensitive these days? He was just saying what everyone was thinking. At least, what everyone back home would be thinking. He moved a step closer to the rope, raising his phone higher to get a better angle for his video. "You must be new at this," he called out to Sergeant Okonkwo. "I don't remember seeing guards like you in the postcards." What Richard didn't know was that Sergeant Okonkwo had been with the Royal Guard for 3 years, after serving 7 years in other military capacities, including 2 tours in conflict zones. The sergeant had stood guard during state visits, from world leaders, through brutal winter storms, and during the hottest day on record in London history. He had never once broken his composure. He also didn't know that several teenagers nearby had recognized Richard from the viral video posted yesterday. They had begun filming him again, their phones capturing every word of his one-sided interaction with the guard. "Dude's back again," one whispered to another. "He's even worse today." As the morning wore on, Richard became increasingly frustrated by Sergeant Okonkwo's lack of reaction. He tried different tactics, asking ridiculous questions, making comments about the uniform, even attempting to analyze the sergeant's disciplined stance. Nothing worked. More tourists gathered, some watching the guard, others increasingly watching Richard with expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust. A family with young children moved away when Richard's comments grew louder and more pointed. By noon, Richard had been there for nearly 2 hours. The sun was directly overhead, and Sergeant Okonkwo hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't flinched at any of Richard's provocations. Sweat beaded on the guardsman's forehead, but his expression remained impassive. Richard, meanwhile, was growing visibly agitated. His face was flushed, not just from the sun but from the mounting frustration. Why wouldn't this man react? What did it take to crack that perfect composure? "Sir." The security officer had returned, his tone firmer now. "I need to ask you to move along. You've been here for quite some time, and your comments are disturbing other visitors." "I paid good money to visit this place," Richard argued, the same defense he'd used yesterday. "I have a right to be here." "You have a right to visit, yes," the officer agreed calmly, "but not to harass the guards or disrupt the experience for other tourists. Please move along now." Richard glared at the officer, then at Sergeant Okonkwo, who continued to stare straight ahead as if neither of them existed. With a huff, Richard finally stepped back. "Fine," he said. "This is boring anyway." As he walked away, he overheard a tour guide telling her group, "The guards change again at 4 o'clock. It's a different ceremony but equally impressive. 4 o'clock. Richard checked his watch. That gave him a few hours to kill, maybe grab some lunch and think of new strategies. Because he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. What Richard didn't realize was that his behavior had not gone unnoticed beyond the immediate vicinity of the palace gates. The videos taken by the teenagers had already accumulated thousands of views online, with comments flooding in from around the world. "Someone needs to stop this guy. Imagine traveling to another country just to be racist. That guard deserves a medal for his restraint." Meanwhile, in a small office inside Buckingham Palace, the head of security was reviewing reports from his officers about a particularly persistent American tourist who seemed fixated on Sergeant Okonkwo. "Keep an eye on him if he returns," the head of security instructed. "If his behavior escalates, we may need to intervene more directly." As Richard walked away from the palace, plotting his return for the afternoon ceremony, he was oblivious to the ripple effects his actions were creating. The videos spreading online, the security team on alert, and the growing number of tourists who recognized him from social media and watched with wary eyes. The stage was set for an afternoon confrontation, with Sergeant Okonkwo standing firm in his duty and Richard growing increasingly determined to provoke a reaction, no matter the cost. Richard spent the afternoon in a pub not far from Buckingham Palace, nursing his third pint and scrolling through his phone. He'd ignored 3 calls from Diane, sending only a brief text that he was exploring on his own and would meet them for dinner. The truth was, he couldn't stop thinking about Sergeant Okonkwo and his unbreakable composure. "Another mate?" the bartender asked, gesturing to Richard's nearly empty glass. "Yeah," Richard nodded, sliding the glass forward. "What's the deal with those palace guards anyway? Are they allowed to talk at all?" The bartender, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Paul, shook his head. "Not while on duty, no. Part of their training. They're proper soldiers, though, not just fancy dress-up. Most have seen combat." "Seems like a waste," Richard muttered. "Standing around all day like statues." Paul raised an eyebrow as he set down the fresh pint. "It's considered one of the highest honors in the military. My cousin served in the Coldstream Guards for 2 years. Said it was the proudest time of his life." Richard took a long sip, wiping foam from his upper lip. "I saw a black guy there yesterday and today. That new?" Paul's friendly expression cooled slightly. "The British armies had soldiers from all over the Commonwealth for generations. Nothing new about it. He moved away to serve another customer, his body language making it clear the conversation was over." Richard checked his watch. 3:30. If he left now, he'd make it back to the palace in time for the 4 o'clock ceremony. He downed the rest of his pint in 3 large gulps, left some money on the bar, and headed out, feeling the alcohol warming his blood and loosening his inhibitions. By the time Richard arrived back at Buckingham Palace, a crowd had already gathered. The afternoon ceremony was a smaller affair than the morning's, but still drew plenty of tourists. Richard pushed his way through, ignoring the annoyed looks and muttered complaints. "Excuse me," he said, not meaning it, as he elbowed past a family with small children. "Coming through." He spotted Sergeant Okonkwo immediately. The Guardsman was in the same position as earlier, standing at attention near the palace gates. Richard felt a surge of something like triumph. He'd found his target again. What Richard didn't notice was that several people in the crowd recognized him from the videos that had been circulating online. Whispers followed him as he made his way to the front. "That's the guy from the video. Someone should call security." "What's wrong with him?" A palace security officer, not the same one as earlier, was already watching Richard closely. He'd been briefed about the American tourist who had been harassing one of the guards. The ceremony began, the precision and tradition of it lost on Richard, who kept his eyes fixed on Sergeant Okonkwo throughout. When it concluded and the guards took their posts, Richard moved right up to the barrier rope, phone in hand. "Back for more, huh?" he called out to Sergeant Okonkwo. "Bet they don't have anything this fancy where you're from." A woman standing nearby gasped. "That's incredibly rude," she said, loud enough for others to hear. Richard ignored her, focusing entirely on the Guardsman. "Do they make you practice that statue act, or does it come naturally?" The security officer moved closer, positioning himself where he could intervene quickly if needed. More phones in the crowd turned toward Richard, capturing his behavior. "Sir," the officer said, "I need to ask you to lower your voice and show respect for the guards." "I'm just asking questions," Richard said, his words slightly slurred. "Freedom of speech and all that." "Sir, this is your final warning," the officer said firmly. "If you continue to disrupt the peace, I'll have to ask you to leave." Richard scowled but took half a step back. The alcohol in his system was fueling a growing sense of injustice. Why was everyone defending this guard? Why was he the bad guy for just speaking his mind? For the next 20 minutes, Richard stood there, making comments just quiet enough that the security officer couldn't justify removing him, but loud enough that those nearby could hear. People gradually moved away from him, creating a small bubble of space that only increased his feeling of isolation and resentment. Then Richard's phone rang. It was Diane again. He declined the call and saw he had 6 missed calls and several, increasingly worried text messages. "Where are you?" "We're at the Tower of London. It's amazing. Please join us." "Richard, are you okay? Please call me back." "Tyler is worried. We both are." The last message sent a surge of guilt through him, quickly, replaced by defensiveness. They were overreacting. He was a grown man. He could do what he wanted. As he put his phone away, he noticed a group of teenagers filming him, whispering and laughing. One of them held up her phone to show her friend something, a video that Richard caught a glimpse of. It was him, from earlier that day, harassing the guard. "Are you filming me?" he demanded, taking a step toward them. "Delete that right now." The teenagers backed away, still filming. "It's a public place," one of them said. "We can film if we want." "You little," Richard started, but was cut off by the security officer stepping between them. "Sir, I think it's time for you to move along," the officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Richard felt the eyes of the crowd on him, felt the judgment in their stares. His face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. But it wasn't his fault. It was the guard, standing there looking so perfect, so untouchable, so different from what Richard thought a royal guard should be. "Fine," he muttered, turning back toward the barrier. "I'll go. Just let me get one more picture." But as he raised his phone, something inside him snapped. In that moment, all the frustration, all the feeling of being dismissed and judged, all the alcohol-fueled resentment came to a head. Before he could stop himself, Richard ducked under the barrier rope. Several people in the crowd gasped. Someone shouted, "Hey, you can't do that!" The security officer immediately moved forward, but Richard was quicker. He strode right up to Sergeant Okonkwo, his phone held out like a weapon. "What makes you so special, huh?" he demanded, his face inches from the guardsman's. "Why won't you talk to me?" Sergeant Okonkwo remained perfectly still, staring straight ahead, though his eyes flickered briefly toward Richard, the first sign that he was aware of the situation unfolding. "I'm talking to you." Richard's voice rose to a shout. In the background, he could hear the security officer calling for backup on his radio, and then Richard did something that would be replayed millions of times in the videos captured by dozens of tourist phones. He reached out and shoved Sergeant Okonkwo's shoulder. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." The shove wasn't hard, but it crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Sergeant Okonkwo remained motionless, his training running deep. Then, following protocol exactly as he had been taught, he stamped his boot once on the ground. The official warning, "King's Guard, stand back." Sergeant Okonkwo's voice rang out, the first words Richard had heard him speak. But Richard, too far gone in his anger, didn't heed the warning. Instead, he reached out to shove the guardsman again, harder this time, and added a racial slur that made the crowd collectively gasp. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for those watching. Sergeant Okonkwo, following the exact procedure drilled into every royal guard for situations where they are physically assaulted, moved with precision and control. In one fluid motion, he brought his rifle down from his shoulder and thrust the butt of it forward. Not to injure, but to create distance between himself and Richard. Richard, unprepared for any kind of response, stumbled backward. His eyes widened, in shock as he lost his balance and fell hard onto the gravel path. "Stay down," Sergeant Okonkwo commanded, his rifle now pointed downward but ready. His voice was steady, professional, showing none of the emotion that must have been coursing through him. "Security is on their way." Richard lay there on the ground, the wind knocked out of him, more from surprise than from the force of the fall. The crowd had gone completely silent for a moment before erupting in a mixture of gasps, exclamations, and the unmistakable sounds of camera shutters clicking and phones recording. 2 security officers reached them within seconds, followed by police officers who had been stationed nearby. Richard was helped to his feet, his face now ashen as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. "He attacked me," Richard said weakly, pointing at Sergeant Okonkwo, who had resumed his position, though his eyes now tracked the situation carefully. "Sir, you crossed the barrier and physically assaulted a King's Guard," one of the police officers said. "Multiple witnesses and video evidence confirm this. I'm placing you under arrest for assault and breach of the peace." As the officers led Richard away, the crowd parted. Some people clapped. Others simply watched in stunned silence. The teenagers who had been filming were already uploading their videos, their faces alight with the knowledge that they had captured something that would definitely go viral. Inside the palace, an urgent call was made to the captain of the guard, informing him of the incident. Within minutes, a replacement guard was dispatched to relieve Sergeant Okonkwo, who would need to provide a statement. As Richard was escorted to a police car waiting outside the palace grounds, the gravity of his actions finally hit him. His vacation was ruined. He might face serious charges. What would Diane and Tyler think? What would his friends back home say when they saw the videos that were undoubtedly already spreading across the internet? But most troubling of all, as the police car pulled away from Buckingham Palace, was the realization dawning on Richard that he wasn't the victim here. For perhaps the first time in his life, he had to consider the possibility that he might be the villain in this story. The holding cell at the police station was cold and smelled of disinfectant. Richard sat on the hard bench, his head in his hands, still trying to process how his London vacation had gone so terribly wrong. His one phone call had been to Diane, a conversation that still echoed painfully in his mind. "You did what?" Her voice had risen in disbelief. "Richard, how could you?" He had no good answer. The alcohol had worn off during the booking process, leaving him with a pounding headache and the sickening clarity of what he'd done. "I don't know," he'd admitted. "I just lost it." The disappointment in her voice cut deeper than anger would have. "Tyler and I will come to the station. The embassy says they'll send someone too." That had been 2 hours ago. Richard looked up as the cell door opened. A police officer stood there, expression neutral. "Your wife and son are here," the officer said. "And someone from your embassy. They're waiting in the interview room." Richard followed the officer down a narrow hallway. Each step seemed to weigh him down further as the reality of his situation settled on his shoulders. This wasn't just a misunderstanding that would blow over. This was serious. The interview room was small, with a table and 4 chairs. Diane sat with her back straight, her face a mask of controlled emotion. Next to her, Tyler slouched in his chair, refusing to make eye contact. Across from them sat a woman in a dark suit who introduced herself as Lisa Thompson from the U.S. Embassy. "Mr. Whitfield," she said as Richard took his seat, "I'm here to explain your situation and the potential consequences." Richard nodded numbly. "You've been charged with assault, harassment with racial aggravation, and breach of the peace," Ms. Thompson explained. "These are serious charges in the UK. Assault alone carries a potential sentence of up to 6 months in prison and a fine." "Prison?" Richard's voice cracked. This couldn't be happening. "That would be the maximum," she clarified. "Given that this is your first offense, if you plead guilty, you might receive a suspended sentence, community service, and a fine. But there will be a criminal record." Diane's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "Can he just pay the fine and come home with us?" Ms. Thompson shook her head. "I'm afraid not. Mr. Whitfield will need to appear before a magistrate tomorrow morning. They'll determine if he can be released on bail until the court date." "Court date?" Richard felt like he was drowning. "How long will that take?" "Cases like this typically take a few weeks to process," Ms. Thompson said. "If bail is granted, you would need to surrender your passport and remain in the UK until your court appearance." Tyler finally looked up, his face a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Dad, do you have any idea what's happening online? You're everywhere." Richard's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "The videos," Tyler said, pulling out his phone. "They've gone viral. You're on every social media platform, every news site." He turned the phone around to show Richard a news article with the headline, "American Tourist Arrested After Racist. Attack on Royal Guard." Below it was a still image captured from one of the videos, showing Richard with his face contorted in anger, finger pointing at Sergeant Okonkwo. "There are dozens of videos," Tyler continued, his voice flat. "From different angles. You can hear everything you said." Richard closed his eyes, the room suddenly spinning. Everything he'd said. Every slur, every insult, captured forever and shared with the world. "The guard has been identified in the media as Sergeant James Okonkwo," Miss Thompson added. "A decorated soldier with 2 combat tours before his Royal Guard assignment. The public reaction has been significant." "What does that mean?" Diane asked. "It means there's considerable public interest in this case," Ms. Thompson explained carefully. "The racial element has touched a nerve. The Crown Prosecution Service will be under pressure to make an example." A knock at the door interrupted them. The officer returned, this time with a tired-looking man in a rumpled suit who introduced himself as Richard's court-appointed solicitor, Mr. Patel. "I've reviewed your case," Mr. Patel said, taking the last empty seat. "And I've watched the videos. Mr. Whitfield, I'll be honest with you. The evidence against you is overwhelming." "So what do we do?" Richard asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "I recommend you plead guilty at tomorrow's hearing," Mr. Patel said. "Show remorse, it's your best chance at leniency." "And then we can go home?" Diane asked. Mr. Patel shook his head. "As Ms. Thompson explained, your husband would need to remain in the UK until the final court date. But there's another matter to discuss." He cleared his throat. "Sergeant Okonkwo's commanding officer has been in touch. The sergeant is willing to provide a statement that could potentially reduce the charges." Richard looked up, surprised. "Why would he do that?" "He hasn't said," Mr. Patel replied, "but it could make a significant difference in your case." The meeting continued for another hour, with Mr. Patel explaining legal procedures and Ms. Thompson outlining what the embassy could and couldn't do to help. By the end, Richard felt hollowed out, a shell of the confident man who had arrived in London just 2 days ago. As Diane and Tyler prepared to leave, they weren't allowed to stay with him overnight. Tyler handed his father a newspaper someone had left in the waiting room. "You should see this," he said quietly. It was an evening edition of a British tabloid. The front page showed a split image. On one side, Richard being led away by police. On the other, a formal military portrait of Sergeant Okonkwo in his dress, uniform, medals displayed on his chest. The headline read, "Respect the uniform. Hero Guard stands tall against racist attack." Tyler met his father's eyes for the first time since entering the room. "Dad, they're saying he could have done much worse to you, but he showed restraint. He followed exactly the protocol he was supposed to follow." Richard stared at the image of Sergeant Okonkwo, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as an object of his inexplicable anger, but as a person, a soldier, someone who had earned his position through merit and discipline. "I really messed up," Richard whispered. Tyler nodded, a flicker of something like hope crossing his face at his father's admission. "Yeah, you did." The next morning, Richard appeared before the magistrate, a stern-faced woman who regarded him over her glasses with cool assessment. Mr. Patel stood beside him as the charges were read. "How do you plead?" the magistrate asked. Richard swallowed hard. "Guilty, Your Honor." The courtroom was packed with journalists and curious onlookers. Richard could feel their eyes on him, judging him. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor. After hearing arguments from both the prosecution and Mr. Patel, the magistrate set a court date for 3 weeks later, and surprisingly, granted bail with conditions. Richard had to surrender his passport, report to a police station daily, and stay at least 500 meters away from any royal residence. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters waited. Cameras flashed as Richard emerged with Diane, Tyler, and Mr. Patel. The solicitor tried to shield them, repeating, "No comment," as they pushed through toward a waiting taxi. "Mr. Whitfield, do you regret your actions? Was this racially motivated?" "What would you say to Sergeant Okonkwo now?" That last question pierced through Richard's fog of shock. What would he say? He still didn't understand his own actions, the irrational anger that had built up inside him over 2 days of watching a man simply doing his job with dignity and discipline. Back at the hotel, things only got worse. Richard's phone had been returned to him after his court appearance, and it immediately began buzzing with notifications. Messages from friends and family back home, some expressing concern, others shock and disappointment. His business partner had texted, "We need to talk about the dealership. This isn't good, Rich." Diane was on her laptop, her face pale. "Richard," she said quietly, "you've been doxxed. Someone posted our home address, the dealership information, everything." "What?" Richard moved to look over her shoulder. Sure enough, someone had created a thread detailing his personal information, including photos of their house back in Ohio, their cars, even pictures of Tyler at his high school graduation. "They're calling for your business to be boycotted," Diane continued, scrolling through comments. "People are leaving negative reviews on every platform." Richard sank onto the bed, the magnitude of the situation crushing him. This wasn't just about facing legal consequences in the UK. His entire life back home was being dismantled by the internet's collective outrage. "What have I done?" he whispered. Tyler, who had been unusually quiet since the courthouse, finally spoke up. "Dad, I think you need to make a statement or something. This isn't going away." "What would I even say?" Richard asked, genuinely at a loss. "The truth," Tyler said simply. "Why did you do it? Why him?" Richard stared at his son, the question forcing him to confront something he'd been avoiding. Why had he fixated on Sergeant Okonkwo? What was it about seeing a black man in that uniform that had triggered such an irrational response? There was no comfortable answer, no explanation that wouldn't force Richard to examine prejudices he'd never acknowledged, even to himself. The realization made him physically ill. "I don't know if I can face that," he admitted quietly. "You have to," Diane said, her voice firm but not unkind. "For all of us, and for yourself." As evening fell over London, Richard stood at the hotel window, looking out at a city that now seemed hostile and foreign. 3 more weeks here, separated from his business, watching his reputation crumble from afar. And somewhere in this same city was Sergeant Okonkwo, a man Richard had never really seen as a person until today. On the nightstand, Richard's phone buzzed with another notification, a news alert. "Royal Guard Sergeant to make statement regarding Palace incident." Richard picked up the phone, heart pounding. What would Sergeant Okonkwo say about him? What could he possibly say that would make any difference now? The answer would come tomorrow, and Richard knew that whatever happened next would change the course of his life forever. Morning light filtered through the thin hotel curtains as Richard sat on the edge of the bed, remote in hand, flipping between British news channels. Every station seemed to be covering the same story, his story. Some showed the video on a loop, his rage-contorted face now familiar to millions. Others featured panels of experts discussing the incident at the palace as a symbol of rising tensions and global racism. "They're ready," Diane said, emerging from the bathroom. She'd been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed despite her attempts to cover it with makeup. Tyler stood by the door, phone in hand, his expression unreadable. Richard nodded, turning off the TV. They were headed to a nearby police station where Sergeant Okonkwo would be making his public statement. Richard's solicitor had arranged for him to be present, suggesting it might help his case to show remorse by facing the man he'd attacked. The thought of seeing Sergeant Okonkwo again made Richard's stomach churn with a mixture of shame, fear, and something else he couldn't quite name. During a sleepless night, he'd been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, prejudices he'd carried without examination, anger he'd misdirected, a lifetime of small moments that had led to that explosive confrontation at the palace gates. Outside the hotel, a small group of reporters had gathered. Word of Richard's location had leaked somehow. Camera flashes erupted as the family emerged, questions flying at them from all directions. "Mr. Whitfield, do you regret your actions? Was this a hate crime?" Have you apologized to Sergeant Okonkwo? Richard kept his head down, Diane's hand tight in his as they pushed through to the waiting taxi. Tyler walked a step behind, as if not wanting to be too closely associated with his father. At the police station, they were led through a side entrance, to avoid the larger media presence out front. Mr. Patel was waiting for them, his expression grave. Sergeant Okonkwo will make his statement to the press in about 15 minutes, he explained. You'll be able to watch from a separate room. Afterward, if both parties agree, there may be an opportunity for a private conversation. Richard swallowed hard. Do you think he'll talk to me? I don't know, Mr. Patel admitted. But he did specifically ask if you would be here today. They were led to a small room with a television mounted on the wall. The screen showed an empty podium set up in the station's briefing room. Microphones clustered at the front. Gradually, the room on screen filled with journalists and photographers. At precisely 10 o'clock, a door opened, and Sergeant Okonkwo entered, flanked by a police spokesperson and a military officer in full-dress uniform. Gone was the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat. Today, Sergeant Okonkwo wore his formal military uniform, medals displayed on his chest, the same image Richard had seen in the newspaper. The police spokesperson introduced him briefly, then stepped aside. Sergeant Okonkwo moved to the podium, his posture as perfect as it had been on guard duty. He looked directly into the cameras, his expression composed and dignified. Good morning, he began, his voice clear and measured. My name is Sergeant James Okonkwo of the King's Guard. 2 days ago, while on duty at Buckingham Palace, I was involved in an incident that has since gained significant public attention. Richard felt himself shrink in his chair as Sergeant Okonkwo continued. I have served in the British Army for 10 years, including 2 tours in conflict zones. For the past 3 years, I have had the honor of serving in the King's Guard, a position I hold with the utmost pride and respect. Sergeant Okonkwo paused, glancing down at his notes before continuing. The protocol for guards when physically assaulted is clear. We are trained to give 1 verbal warning, then use reasonable force to neutralize the threat. In this instance, I followed that protocol exactly. The room on screen was completely silent, every journalist hanging on his words. What the videos don't show, Sergeant Okonkwo continued, is that I had observed this individual for nearly 2 days. I was aware of his escalating behavior and his apparent fixation on me specifically. Richard felt a chill run through him. All that time he'd thought the guard hadn't noticed him, hadn't heard his comments. Sergeant Okonkwo had been aware of everything. I want to address the racial element of this incident directly, Sergeant Okonkwo said, his voice still calm but with an undercurrent of emotion now. Throughout my career I have encountered prejudice. It is an unfortunate reality for many who serve, but I have never allowed it to define me or deter me from my duty. He straightened slightly, his chin lifting. I stand before you not as a victim, but as a soldier who acted as trained with restraint and professionalism. I did my duty, nothing more and nothing less. A reporter called out, "Will you be pursuing additional charges for hate speech?" Sergeant Okonkwo raised a hand. I'll take questions shortly. But first, I have something important to say. He looked directly into the camera, and Richard had the uncanny feeling that the sergeant was somehow looking right at him. To Mr. Richard Whitfield, I do not know what led you to act as you did. I do not know what you saw when you looked at me in that uniform. But I know this. That uniform represents centuries of service and sacrifice by people of all backgrounds. When I wear it, I honor not only my own service but that of every soldier who came before me, including the thousands of Commonwealth soldiers who fought and died for Britain in 2 world wars and beyond. In the viewing room, Richard felt tears welling in his eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. Diane reached for his hand. I understand you are facing serious charges, Sergeant Okonkwo continued, and while I cannot excuse your actions, I have provided a statement to the Crown Prosecution Service indicating that I believe your remorse to be genuine and that I do not wish to see the maximum penalties applied in this case. Murmurs rippled through the press room. Richard stared at the screen in disbelief. I do this not out of weakness but from a position of strength, Sergeant Okonkwo explained. True justice must be tempered with mercy and understanding. This incident reflects broader issues that punishment alone cannot solve. He then took questions from reporters for about 10 minutes, answering each with the same measured dignity that had characterized his statement. When asked if he had experienced racism before in his role, he acknowledged that he had, but emphasized that the vast majority of people showed nothing but respect for the uniform and those who wore it. As the press conference ended, Mr. Patel entered the viewing room. Sergeant Okonkwo has agreed to speak with you privately, Mr. Whitfield, if you're willing. Richard nodded, his throat too tight to speak. They were led to a small conference room where Sergeant Okonkwo waited, standing by the window, still in his formal uniform. He turned as they entered, his expression neutral. Mr. Whitfield, he said with a small nod. Mrs. Whitfield, Tyler. Richard was struck by the fact that Sergeant Okonkwo knew their names, had taken the time to learn about the family he'd never spoken to. Sergeant Okonkwo, Richard managed, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say. Perhaps start with why, Sergeant Okonkwo suggested, his tone not unkind. Help me understand. Richard looked at this man who had every reason to hate him but was instead offering him a chance to explain himself. He felt stripped bare, all his defenses useless. I don't fully understand it myself, Richard admitted. When I saw you there, in that uniform, something in me just rebelled against it, like you didn't belong there. And I know now how wrong that was. Sergeant Okonkwo nodded slowly. The uniform represents something to you, something you feel should be protected. Yes, Richard whispered. And I never questioned why I felt that way, who I thought deserved to wear it. I never examined any of it until now. And now, Richard met his eyes directly for the first time. Now I see a soldier, a man who served his country with honor, someone who showed me more mercy than I deserved. Sergeant Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. My grandfather fought for Britain in World War II, you know. He never got to wear the red tunic, but he bled in the same mud as British soldiers. When I stand at that post, I stand for him too. Richard nodded, unable to speak as the full weight of his ignorance crashed down on him. I won't pretend what you did didn't hurt, Sergeant Okonkwo continued. Not the physical part. I've faced worse, in combat. But to be reduced to nothing but my skin color, to have my service and sacrifice dismissed, that cut deep. I'm sorry, Richard said, the words wholly inadequate but all he had. Truly sorry. I believe you, Sergeant Okonkwo said simply. That's why I made the statement I did. Not to absolve you, but to give you a chance to do better. The meeting lasted only 15 minutes, but for Richard, it was the beginning of a much longer journey. As they left the police station through the back door, avoiding the press, Tyler finally spoke directly to his father. What happens now, Dad? Richard looked at his son, seeing the hurt and confusion in his eyes. Now we face the consequences, and then we try to be better. 3 weeks later, Richard stood before a judge in a London courtroom. Following Sergeant Okonkwo's statement and Richard's guilty plea, he received a suspended 6-month sentence, a substantial fine, half of which would go to a veterans charity of Sergeant Okonkwo's choosing, and an order to complete an anti-racism education program upon his return to the U.S. The story had largely faded from headlines by the time the Whitfield family boarded their flight home, but the impact lingered. Richard's business partner had reluctantly asked for a buyout, unwilling to have the dealership associated with the viral incident. Former friends had distanced themselves. The family faced a difficult reintegration into their community. On the plane. As London disappeared beneath the clouds, Diane squeezed Richard's hand. It's going to be hard, she said quietly. Richard nodded. I know, but maybe it should be. He looked out the window, thinking of Sergeant Okonkwo, who had returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace. Richard had seen a news item about it. Tourists now sometimes requested selfies specifically with the sergeant, who had become something of a celebrity. More importantly, The palace had used the incident to highlight the diversity of the guards and the long history of Commonwealth soldiers serving the crown. A small step, perhaps, but change often began with small steps. Richard closed his eyes, the weight of his actions still heavy on his shoulders, but alongside it now was something new, a determination to understand, to learn, to do the hard work of examining his own prejudices and dismantling them one by one. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a beginning.